Hi, I'm going to say that. This is Stu from Love Yoga Anatomy, and this is our first collaboration with Purple Valley. And we're here with David Keil. How do you say it? Which one is it?
It's Kyle,
Kyle.
for the official record.
Kyle. And Super Anatomy, Yoga Anatomy, boffin, should we say? But I've been told to point out that there's only one aspect of his fully rounded yoga knowledge.
Thank you.
And yeah, super exciting to be here and to be able
good to be here.
grill you with all these questions.
Oh,
But
okay. Why not?
Janu Sirsasana C and Setu Bandhasana. They just seem,
Oh, those are my two favorite
Are they your
postures,
favorite?
actually. Yeah, those are my favorites.
they just seem, there's a fragility there and an increased risk of injury. Do you think I'm right in saying that? Or?
They're definitely further towards the edge in level of difficulty, right? They're moving up. If we made a scale of difficulty of postures, starting at 0, ending at 10, those we would be getting up into the 7, 8 range. And they're in primary, right? So, Janu C, that's a tricky one. But here's where the all or none, right or wrong kind of thing comes in. People take the approach that either they're doing it fully, completely, or they're not. They don't allow themselves to be somewhere in between and let it evolve. And that's where the trouble comes. Oh, when either a student is being rigid on themselves or a teacher is being rigid, and it's like, no, your knee has to be down, no, your heel has to be up, or no, all of your toes have to be on the floor. For a total beginner, of course, that's not going to work. I'm not saying most teachers do that. Hopefully they don't. But how do you make yourself comfortable and in a place with a posture like Janu C where there's some sense of progression, like you know what direction you're going with it, even though you're not there. And the harder part is to be okay with that. That's the thing. It's because we all want to do it, be done with it. Feel like we have accomplished Janu Sirsasana C. And the work is then to be okay with not having accomplished it and still going on with your practice.
I suppose the issues I have with it are the external rotation of the tibia relative to the knee.
I think, the tibial rotation at the knee it's always more externally than it is internally. So it's designed to go more in that direction anyway. Like if we had to flip it back around the other way, that would be really crazy. And the external rotation opens up the inside of the knee. But I think the bigger problem, and we can talk about this when we get to half lotus or full lotus, which I'm sure we're going to get to,
Maybe.
is all of these types of postures come back to the hip being open enough.
Yeah. So what did you see are the key movements then in, say, Janu Sirsasana C? What should be happening at the hip? What should be happening at the knee, ankle?
Well, if we start with the foot, your Achilles tendon actually needs to be open enough for the toes to get on the floor properly. That's a restrictor that people miss out on all the time. People think their ankle rotates. I've heard that before. Your ankle doesn't rotate, just so everybody knows the ankle doesn't rotate. If I go into it, this to get the knee down actually requires the. Why don't I just do it for a second? I always start with the knee up, because that's a less fragile position for the knee, whether it's half lotus or this type of posture anyway. So for the toes to get down, you're going to have to rotate at the knee. So there's external rotation. Less pressure higher, more pressure as it goes lower. But in order for it to lower, you can see the Achilles tendon has to lengthen. Yeah. So if that doesn't lengthen, then that's going to float, and then people will fall over onto that side. And then it's imbalanced, it's not grounded, and that's more likely. And then it's stuck in some position and there's a lot of tension, and then you try to go forward on it. And so it's the combination of things. So somebody has to be comfortable with this.
And we, as a rule, we don't use props in Ashtanga, which then, sometimes means that we've got that knee floating in the air, whether we're going forwards or not. I mean, one of the rules I've always heard is like, okay, if the knee is not on the floor, then you don't go forwards. But if it's in the air, even if you're sitting there, it's vulnerable?
It's vulnerable to somebody coming by and pressing it down.
Right.
It's certainly more vulnerable than if it were on the ground. There's no question about that, but it's being held in tension. So I'm not sure that it's so. I would worry more about the energy of trying to bring it down towards the floor, coming internally, while it's in that position. Yeah. Too soon.
So letting gravity rather than engaging to draw it down.
Yeah. Especially in that one. Yeah. That's what I would think. Okay. Yeah. I like you said, it's not typical to use blocks and bolsters and straps and all of that stuff in Ashtanga. I think, it's meant for the teacher to basically be the blocks and the bolsters, which I do a lot of. But, sometimes blocks are just helpful. And I use them, but if you're going to choose to do that, you have to choose to know with whom, when, and when to take it away. Yeah. That's
like a crutch, tricky. You get too dependent.
Yeah. You have to set a tone that this is not long term, this is not forever, but if I'm not here, what are you going to do?
Okay. Setu Bandhasana. Neck extension, weight bearing.
Neck extension, weight bearing. Okay, so Setu Bandhasana, I think, is really important to look at in terms of sequencing. Yeah. It's the last pose. From a traditional point of view, you wouldn't be doing that pose until you've done every other pose successfully. Okay. So if we go backwards in the sequence, and this is how I really like to look at Ashtanga, is where things live relative to other things. Because I think it says a lot about what we need to work on. I would take it back to Bujapidasana. Chin is supposed to touch the floor. Most people go to the top of the head. I think it's a mistake. I think people
hovering
end up...
or
I
hover face down but not touching.
Lightly touching. I would rather see somebody, lightly touching their forehead than rolling onto the top of their head and over the... Because then all the weight goes into the head and they push back and then they fall on their bottom. But anyway, if we look at it how it's supposed to be done, let's say we're going to go idealistic, traditional chin. And if you're extending your chin forward, at that moment you're strengthening the back of your neck, but not in a weight-bearing way. And then go Kurmasana, same. Neck is in full extension like a tortoise. Then you start working with leg behind head, which strengthens the back of the neck. Get a little stretch in Garbha, and then continue on. You're doing all of this next. You're rolling on your neck. Right? So there's this whole sequence of rolling onto your neck, rolling off your neck, extending your neck that happens before it. And if you can do all of those things correctly, hopefully, you've strengthened your neck for something like Setu Bandhasana.
I suppose when I've seen people do it, like 90% people doing it, they're hinging. There's not much of a... Because they're not open enough in the chest, then they get the lift there by hinging at the neck. So there's not a nice curve, and it just looks...
It looks precarious anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, putting your leg behind your head to the average person looks pretty precarious anyway. I think too many people make it into a back bend. And I think it's more like a low arch. Yeah. Because the legs are straight, they're not supposed to be bent. So it's only supposed to get so high. I think too many people keep their knees too bent. Yeah. And therefore everything gets higher as opposed to staying low.
Then they're going to hinge more maybe.
Yeah, maybe. It's a difficult posture. I can't say I'm in love with it.
No. But then, general people have had whiplash injuries or neck issues, that sort of thing.
Well, they need to be more careful for sure. No doubt about it. Often in those types of injuries, compressing the neck in that direction is usually more trouble just because that tends to create more of a herniation or something. If there's one there, then exacerbate it. But still, weight bearing on the head, should be looked at carefully for those people on an individual basis. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So maybe we should backtrack a little bit because we sort of started wham bam into the middle, haven't we?
Yeah, why not?
So let's think about just in the whole sphere of things, yoga anatomy, and if people are seeking a knowledge of yoga anatomy, how is it going to help them with the practice? How is that going to translate in in their practice? In what ways do you see that?
Yeah. It's a good question. I ask it of myself regularly. I mean, I teach it.
Yeah.
Actually, in when I did the yoga anatomy videos in 2008, I actually say that in the introduction.
Yeah.
And I remember the editor was like, we're taking that out, right? And I'm like, no, leave it. Because one should be asking a question of why they're doing what they're doing
for sure.
and what it's for. I think I say there, a sincere practitioner of yoga in the big picture, they don't need to know any anatomy.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. However, I teach it, so I have to make a good argument for it.
Let's have it.
It's almost like being a chef and growing your own vegetables and your own herbs and spices.
Yeah.
Right? There's an appreciation then for the food that you're cooking and making and how you're preparing it and the energy and the love you're putting into it. And so, with asana practice, you're using your body. And if you look deeply into the body, it becomes very spiritual. I mean, just look, somebody, go ahead and look up, how a muscle actually contracts. Like on a cellular level, I mean, it's just unbelievable. It's like magic.
Yeah.
And so it gets you very close to spirituality, just like anything you look into, as it should. Now, backing out from that, there's the practical side of it as well, and stuff we've already talked about. This more objective point of view of what's going on in your body and making decisions based on that is definitely fed by having a good understanding of your own anatomy. Right? Like, what is it that I'm actually doing? What is the effect of that?
Yeah.
Because then you have these visuals in your mind of what fits together and how it functions together. And hopefully it's an integrated way of seeing the body, because if it's piece by piece, you'll be missing all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
But when you have those sort of visuals in your mind, and you can imagine what's going on in your body, you might accentuate certain things, or de-accentuate.
Sounds
things.
good to me.
Yeah, right. That'll work. De-accentuate
American
things.
word.
Yeah, we'll just make them up as we go along. That's what we typically do in America. And it's even more important as a teacher, because I'm looking at students' bodies and I'm trying to see them for who they are.
Yeah.
Before I start imposing all of my ideas of how the practice is supposed to be, I really need to observe their anatomy, because I'm watching them move, so that's what I'm seeing. As objectively as possible, how does their anatomy move or not move?
Yeah.
Or in what way does it move? Is it integrated? Is it unintegrated? So everything I've learned about anatomy is, tied into how I see people practicing, and then what I decide to do, hopefully based on that objective point of view of who they are, and less on my biased point of view of how I think the practice should be.
Yeah.
And I like to think it happens for me as a practitioner as well, because I also strive through the anatomy to have an integrated practice, integrated movement, efficiency of movement. Not that the anatomy isn't there to sort of tie you into thinking about what's right or what's wrong, or what's good or what's bad.
Mm-hmm.
But feeding your experience of the practice.
I know my wife, she says to me, I can see you're analyzing too much in the postures. I can almost see your brain working. And I can see that in myself. And I think that's the resistance that some people feel about, if they take on too much information, it's going to spoil their stillness in the posture or their focus. And I can sort of see that in myself. I'm constantly thinking, okay, externally rotate that hip. And,
I don't do that. Just so
you don't do that?
No.
So that's pretty cool. So you take your knowledge and subconsciously you just do it.
Well, the body's going to move.
Yeah.
It's more like we're expressing the postures with our anatomy. We're not trying to make our anatomy fit into a particular posture. That's where trouble starts to happen. We want to embody the posture in a way that we're expressing it with our own anatomy. Because what happens is, otherwise you get stuck in this idea that there's always something wrong, or there's always something to fix, perhaps. Maybe not that something's wrong, but maybe everything's just fine the way it is.
The way it is, leave it alone.
Yeah. I mean, this is where most people intersect with anatomy. Like even those who really don't want to do it, relative to thinking about things too much. And I can say more about that, but they want to intersect with it when they're injured, or when they can't do
Yes,
something.
yes.
Those are the points of intersection
Yeah.
that are most common. That all of a sudden people start Googling stuff and they start self-diagnosing themselves,
Yeah.
and it's unfortunate. Sometimes they get it right. Mostly they probably get it wrong.
Yeah.
But it's for people who think it's going to cause them to think too much. They might have a habit of thinking too much already.
That would
Maybe.
be me too, I suppose. Yeah. So maybe
I
it's
mean-
just I'm thinking about that instead of thinking about what I'm going to be shopping for or whatever.
Right. I guess that's better. That's
Maybe.
just a step in the right direction,
Yeah,
isn't
yeah.
it? Yeah.
It's just I think sometimes when you're thinking of asanas and you look at the detail of an asana and you say, okay, let's say Trikonasana for instance, and maybe you'll disagree with what I'm going to say anyway, but
That's fine.
let's
I'll try not to.
let's say we've stepped forward with our left leg and we might say that, okay, if we externally rotate our right hip, it might allow us to stack our hips better one over the other. And so then that involves some sort of conscious thought process, which then takes us a little deeper into the posture.
But I think everybody goes through this process of figuring out the posture,
Yeah.
right? When you first start, you have to think about everything. You don't have a choice, right? There's no way not to, because you haven't done it before, so you have to figure it out. Maybe you're not using anatomical words in your mind, but you're feeling it out or thinking about it, or maybe somebody says try to turn your foot that way or that way. It's the same thing. But once you establish a pattern of doing that, you can drop the thinking part.
Okay.
You set
Something
up.
to start with and get the patterns going.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then, relax into it for a while. And that means a year in my mind at least.
Okay.
And then you're really exploring it. 2
Yeah.
days.
Too quick.
Yeah, too quick. And in terms of thinking too much, yoga isn't about not thinking. It's about constant. It's about many things really, but having knowledge that you have behind you as you go into a practice or you try to make something happen. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. That'd be like saying, well, Guruji shouldn't have read too much philosophy. Because then he'd be thinking about it too much when he gives, conference.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not true, right?
You're building on your knowledge base something, and I think you draw on a lot of stuff subconsciously, like you were saying before. Yeah. It's in there, and you're drawing on. You don't necessarily have to process it in the front of your mind.
Right. Or it might be the difference of, there's mental knowledge, and then there's experiential knowledge. So we always use that mental knowledge as a base to have an experience from, then test it in the real world. So in that sense, from subconscious to conscious, in a way. So once you learn it all, it doesn't mean you have to think about everything all the time, but it will color your experience nonetheless.
Yeah. So let's ask you then, fascia, next. That's, we have these things in yoga circles, don't we? Something bubbles to the surface. One time it was like nutation, counter-nutation, the sacrum. we've had a discussion about that ourselves, if anybody's, that might come up again. But at the moment there's a lot in bodywork circles as well about fascia and maybe that it influences the way we should do our practice or not. How do you, first of all, maybe explain for people what fascia is as you see it, and then how it relates to the practice maybe?
Okay. Well, first, I think it's in the forefront of everybody's mind because there's been more research in the last 5 to 10 years on fascia than there ever has been in the history of man.
Yeah.
Right now, there's a fascial congress that meets
Yeah.
every 2 or 3 years or whatever it is, which is great because they're discovering all kinds of things and disproving all kinds of other things. So, well, fascia is a type of connective tissue. Most people will substitute the word fascia for connective tissue. Not technically right, it doesn't really matter. And they do that because it's the most abundant type in the body. And so fascia is the specific type of connective tissue that is in and around muscles. So it's highly abundant in the body. But there's other tendons they're almost related to muscles anyway, but ligaments are a type of connective tissue. There's another layer under the skin, and there's all kinds of types of connective tissue going on in the body. And related to practice, again, if we start going too far off into the science, then we're going to lose some of the spirituality. So it's finding this balance of the two. the intersection is because fascia can restrict movement. If it's gummed up, if it's stuck, if it's tight, if you have scar tissue, which is another type of, connective tissue. And so that's where we're kind of intersecting with it. It's where we deal with our tension and our tightness. A component of that is the fascia or the connective tissue. The other part of that is the nerves related to the contractile function of muscles. So these things start mixing together because, muscle is created by tubes of fascia filled in with proteins. So when we stretch a muscle, we're stretching the connective tissue or the fascia, as well as asking the muscle, well, not always, but usually asking the nervous system to stop stimulating that muscle so we can lengthen it.
Yeah.
And that's never going to be 100% off anyway, but we're dealing with all of those things.
Do you buy into the three-dimensional model of fascia, permeating right the way through the body, from the superficial, through the muscle, everywhere?
Yeah, I buy that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. And so, feeding on from that, there's some talk about the fact that fascia takes longer to respond or needs longer potentially in a stretch than a muscle does. So would we change the way we practice at all?
Are we going into yin yoga?
Maybe not, I don't think.
Okay. Not that far.
No.
Into holding postures that long.
No. But maybe also just different. I've heard talk about, not being so linear around the joints, exploring many of the different angles around the joints, because it will help spread and open in many more directions than anything like too linear. That's where I'm going, really.
Okay. Well, there's different movement techniques and different exercises and stretching programs, and yoga lives in some big body of movement-related art / science / spirituality stuff.
Yeah.
There's something to be said for tradition, and again, we get out on these edges of things and we start to then change what the tradition was. Sometimes for the better, sometimes because we just think we're doing it better. Should you have fluid movement around the entirety of your joint? Yes. So instead of thinking about a practice as linear, then internally you can access different parts even within a particular posture. Turn things on, turn things off, or you can just flop into it and be in it.
Yeah.
And it's another place where, I guess you could use anatomy to think about how you're putting pressure into particular joints. But in terms of the responsiveness of connective tissue, to be honest with you, I'd have to see, what research was saying what.
Yeah. For sure.
I mean, my personal experience of connective tissue is it doesn't take much more than unless it's really stuck, within about 5 to 10 seconds of having pressure on it, whether that's coming from fingertips or coming from body weight, gravity, and tension being added to it by holding your foot and pulling yourself forward, within 5 to 10 seconds it starts to loosen and give. How long you need to stay there for effectiveness, that's holding a stretch has been debated for a very long time now. Yeah. And the average number that always comes up is about 30 seconds.
Yeah, which equates to sort of about 5 breaths, doesn't it? 5, 6
5 to 8 breaths, somewhere in there.
Mm.
And I mean, look at the result. You can watch people do Ashtanga where they only hold it for 5 breaths, and you see people's bodies change within 1 year.
Yeah.
And it's much more to do with consistency of practice than it is with the fact that they're holding it for a short amount of time versus holding it a long amount of time.
Yeah.
So if you do a long held posture once a week, doesn't mean,
anything's going to change.
No.
You touched on it just now. We were talking about the nervous system, physical body. How much of we can either call it range of motion around a joint or flexibility. How much is that governed by the nervous system, and how much is, so now we're not talking about within the 5 breaths, we're talking maybe about
just
a 6-month program.
Right.
How much is about the reprogramming of the nervous system, shall we say, and how much of it is about physical change to the muscle length? What do you think?
Do you want to include connective tissue and bone structure as well?
Yeah,
why not?
We got all afternoon.
Well, I mean, you want to look at it from the point of view of all of the possibilities that could be restricting range of motion, right? So how far can we move a joint? The deepest potential level of restriction is the bone structure. And I know a lot has been made out of bone structure, and it's certainly a possibility. Most of us live in a range of motion that's average, and then there's a few outliers in both directions. It's like a typical bell curve. There's 5% out who are super flexible, 5% who are, their bone shape just won't allow them to do something.
Yeah.
And then on top of that is the ligamentous structures that allow for restrict movement at joints.
Yeah.
So it's possible that, if ligaments are particularly tight, they add to restriction. If your ligaments are generally loose, they'll allow for more, which gets into the connective tissue end of things. And then at that point, I would say you're dealing with the neuromuscular relationship, the nervous system feeding the muscle, creating tension, and then that kind of cohabitates with the fascial tension at that level. Regardless of which one it is, the only one we can change is really the neuromuscular fascial component. That's the only one we can do anything.
Bones,
And the ligaments, probably not a good idea to overstretch too many ligaments, because then the joints move around too much and they wear, and arthritis and all that kind of stuff sets in. It's something I talk a lot about in the workshop, which is, neuromuscular patterns. We all have sort of patterns of movement, ways of moving from things that we've done. If we've trained to be a footballer or play tennis or golf or dance or gymnastics, whatever that is, you're training your body to move in a very, very particular way. Probably the most common patterns are running and cycling, and I usually pick on the runners and the cyclists a little bit. Not because I don't like running and cycling, not that I do it, but just because...
Easy targets.
Well, it's very contrary to yoga, especially because of the hips and how open we really want the hips to be in our yoga practice. So we're up against these old patterns, and we're trying to retrain those patterns. So there's a component of letting the patterns go, and then feeding the opposite muscles in terms of strength to help create balance there again. We always want to look at both sides of that equation. It's not like we're just trying to stretch stuff, we're also trying to strengthen stuff.
And how can we do that in our practice? Because I'm very mindful of that, people quite often get injured because they've got too much flexibility and not enough strength around the same sort of areas. They can't control that flexibility.
Yeah, I would say, I've worked with a few students this way. I don't let them go all the way into postures. I make them hold before the edge of the posture so that they have to engage the muscles. Like they don't have a choice. Because otherwise they'll just be flopping into the end of their range of motion, and they'll just be feeding that flexibility but not working on this. So I pull them out a little bit. Make them engage.
Then
strong
engaging,
legs.
Working against gravity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I don't know what else I could do. Some postures are going to feed it in one direction. Other postures feed it in another direction.
Some postures you feel that strength component to it, don't you?
Yeah, of course. Inversions, handstands, all of that kind of stuff you would definitely feel. It's like I look at every pose is made of a combination of strength, flexibility, and technique. And the technique is broad. It could include breath and bandha and all that stuff. But it's always some combination of those things.
I remember, the first day we met, I said to you, you said to me, what are you going to talk about then? And I said, well, we want to talk about healthy practice, safe practice, that sort of thing. And I seem to think, I remember you saying, oh, that's cool. There are 3 major things you need to be thinking about. Am I dreaming that?
3 main things.
I was dreaming.
Yeah, I who knows what I said then.
Yeah.
I change my mind probably
all the time. So
regularly, I hope.
Yeah, which, evolvement. If we want to, are there things that we should be thinking of alignment-wise, healthy practice-wise, as sort of globally maybe, that we take throughout our whole practice, just to make our practice as long and sustained as possible?
First and foremost is don't ignore things in your body that are talking to you.
Like pain.
Like pain. And, that's not as simple. It's an easy thing to say, but we've all had the experience of experiencing different types of pain and sensations in our body. So my general rule for it is things that are like in a very specific spot, pay really close attention to.
Yeah.
Things that are more generalized and broad, a little yellow flag goes up, but just be mindful of it. And the other thing is to fool yourself and think that a very strong asana practice is only magically healing somehow, and that you can't possibly get injured doing it.
Because it's yoga.
Because it's yoga,
Yeah.
exactly. You can get injured very badly, in fact. So you need to listen to things. I'm not saying to not try. I'm not saying to not, put your energy in and, go for it. Go for it, but go for it and also pay attention to what's coming back from your body, what it's saying to you. It might not even be while you're practicing.
Yeah.
If you're completely wiped out for the rest of the day, that might be telling you something, because the more that builds up, that leads to, injuries long term.
On injury side, and I'm sure it's probably the same on your website, one of the most hits we get is articles about yoga butt,
I'd asked somebody what yoga butt was. I thought it was some new trend in the gym or something.
It's like getting your butt ready for the beach, so it's nice and beach ball shaped. No.
Right. That's a Shalabhasana. Easy. No problem.
No, so like for those that missed that bit, ischial tuberosity pain, so like where your sit bone is, pain on your sit bone. And why is it happening, potentially? Did you see any commonalities between the types of people it happens in? And B, what is the best way to deal with it once you got it? There's going to be other ways, but maybe from your experience.
Sure. I'll try to take the broadest point of view of this.
Cool.
Because there's not one specific cause anyway.
Yeah.
If you start to look for it as one specific, you're going to miss all kinds of stuff, right? Yeah. One reason it happens, I think, is right side, left side dominance. Tensional patterns that are just there naturally because we are right-handed or left-handed or right-sided or left-sided, if you will. And what often goes along with that is one side of our pelvis is naturally tilted more forward or backward than the other. So that creates tension in the hamstrings in a different way. Layered on top of that is the majority of activities that we do require us to use our hamstrings, because most of the activities we do involve walking or running. And now we're talking like the average everyday people who've built up tension over long periods of time, whether it be running or cycling or gymnastics, the whole list of things that we do. Hamstrings get tight. They're there for walking. That's what they were designed, and running. That's what they were designed to be for. So if they're tight and we start doing a lot of forward bends, that can also irritate, the tendon at the end of the hamstring or on the bone itself, where the connective tissue wraps onto the bone. I've also found a lot of people who end up with pain in their sit bone from trigger points in the gluteus minimus muscle.
Okay. So that's sitting on the side of your hip here for anybody that's
quite deep.
Rusty.
You can Google it. Deep gluteals can also refer into there. There's other muscles that refer into that zone as well, anyhow. So depending on which one of those causes it might be, we might do different things with those people.
Okay.
So if we determine that it's gluteals, maybe we do more pigeon, double pigeon stuff to stretch those tissues, for instance. If it ends up being because of a torn hamstring, which is another reason why you overstretch the hamstring in one moment and it makes a nice popping noise and some pain is there. I have a whole article about this, but the number one common thing people do wrong in that particular situation is to keep their knees bent when they're doing forward bends. I say this with some caution because it doesn't mean that you should have really rigid legs and go super far after you tear your hamstring.
So perhaps explain why this thing about bending the knee is advised for people with, say, aggravated ischial tuberosities.
Well, it might be appropriate for other reasons, assuming it's not like a torn hamstring.
Okay.
Here's the thing is,
why are we being told to do it in the first place?
Well, I think it seems logical that if you shorten the hamstrings, there's less tension on them.
So by bending the knee?
By bending the knee, you shorten one end of the hamstring. But
The drawback?
the drawback is you lengthen the opposite end. So when you bend the knee, when you've torn your hamstring near the ischial tuberosity, you're actually loading more stretch into the torn end. And you're avoiding stretching the other end.
Yeah.
So what I suggest is keep the legs straight, just don't go as deep.
Any activation going on?
Yeah, on the front of the leg.
Front of the leg?
Strongly.
And inner thighs?
Sure.
Okay.
Make sure the foot is straight and the leg is straight as well.
Yeah.
And sometimes the sit bone pain is from adductor magnus tear.
Yes, but they'll feel that slightly more medial, won't they?
Well, either that or the difference will be they feel the sit bone pain when they do a wide leg forward bend, but not when they do it with their legs together.
So Upavishta Konasana,
Upavishta Prasarita. If you feel it there, but not when you do Padangushtasana, it's adductor magnus, and then bending the knee doesn't even matter.
Yeah.
Because they don't cross.
Yeah. You mentioned just now feet rolling out. You know, I see that all the time. People with forward any sort of Janu Sirsasana and that leg's like over there somewhere. And is that just mindfulness, or will it actually alter the posture dynamically too? I mean, everybody seems to be able to just put it straight back. It doesn't seem to be that it's drawn out there through restriction.
Yeah.
It's
more like a lack of engagement that allows it to roll out. I think very naturally when we fold forward, the head of our femur likes to externally rotate a bit to make more space for the pelvis to come forward, and that's where it's coming from. But if we engage it, then it's straight.
Awareness.
Yeah. Yeah, just some awareness and attention to it. It's very common. And if somebody has particularly tight hamstrings, then the body is also rotating the leg to avoid that tension.
Yeah. And
unconsciously, of course.
On the other side of things, I quite often see people with their foot inverted, so with the sole of the foot more medially rotated towards the center, and then that seems harder for them to get it back. And also then when they do things like Ustrasana and the feet are behind, it seems hard for them to get that little toe down on the floor.
Does the little toe have to be down?
Well, if the foot is level?
I think I've been doing that wrong. On the first part of it, I think that comes back to that there's still tension in the hamstring, or secondarily the bone shape at the hip joint, which is one of the most variable. That and the shoulder are the most variable for bone shape.
I've seen images, and it's just like a tremendous amount of angle differences you can have in this way and that way.
Well, there's like 3 different angles actually coming together, and all of them have variability. So if you go to the extreme of all of them in your body, then you might never put your leg behind your head. Yeah, because you've got the socket, which can tilt down or up or sideways or front, and then you've got the angle of the head, which can be of quite an angle, and then there's another angle going sideways. The Q angle, exactly. Q angle is the femur coming down.
But there's just 2, isn't there? So
and then there's the length, and there's the length of the neck, which is a factor as well.
Yeah.
But I think the foot rolling in, I think if you look closely, you'll find that the femur is externally rotated. And that's like the tension trying to like hold on.
And pull it back.
Yeah. Going back to Ustrasana, pinky toe. Well, the femur and hip are in some way out of it because you bent the knee.
Yeah.
So then it's rotation of the lower leg anyway.
So when you were saying pinky toe doesn't need to be down?
Well,
it just seems to square the foot up. It gives you like a stable base, or not?
What if you have a different shaped foot than the other person?
Snip a few toes off?
Take a toe off?
Yeah.
Put a toe extension on?
Yeah.
I mean, because my toes kind of line up. I know people who have their pinky toe way out here.
Yeah. Getting back to...
So look at what I would look at is the quality of, are they able to press their foot into the floor?
Yeah.
The detail of the pinky up, pinky down?
Yeah.
What if they wore high-toed shoes for a long time and their pinky's tight? I don't know.
I suppose I'm thinking rather than little toes, that this part of the foot here, can you see that on camera? This part of the foot here is actually flat on the floor as against maybe the foot being like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, in general, I would look for the midline of the foot to be on the floor, and if a toe's floating or not.
Yeah.
I personally, the anatomist, I don't care. I don't care.
Cool.
But everybody else, you can care.
You can care about that. You can care about that pinky toe.
Yeah.
So we sort of touched on this, maybe in the chat at the beginning about what to do if you notice a restriction in your body between one side or the other, and is it that one side is more open, or is it the other side is being restricted? But also, as well as that, quite often for many people, there seems to be one body part that's not cooperating. You know, it doesn't want to open. I've met yoga teachers that know what they're doing, and they've got tight hips in external rotation, shall we say, and they've had them for 20 years. And they're doing openers and they're doing stuff. Everything else has changed, but that's not changing.
Maybe at that point it's just bone shape.
Bone shape, you think?
20 years, sincere, dedicated, daily practice, and it hasn't changed?
Yeah.
What else could it be?
Well, sometimes I take those people and I do like a PNF stretch with them, or a post-isometric stretch.
And it changes?
And it changes.
Okay.
So, but then they'll be back, you know, it just seems like do you go for the emotional muscle relationship thing? Could it be that's where they're hiding their secrets? Somebody said to me once, that's where I must be hiding my secrets.
Yeah.
And I thought,
yes,
sometimes
definitely.
it's hamstrings, just like rock.
Yeah. I've seen a lot of those.
Just not changing, but everything, the hips are opening, the upper back is opening.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like everybody's going to have something they're going to run into.
No easy answer.
A good teacher.
Yeah.
That part of your body.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can do a particular technique and change it, then that would say to me, then no, it's probably not bone shape. There's got to be, you know, something else going on, and maybe they are hiding a secret. Maybe it's some emotional, spiritual, karmic thing that has stuck in their body. I definitely see relationship between emotions and body areas and body parts. That, for sure. Put people in certain positions and they'll just cry.
Yeah. Seems to be a lot to do chest, hips.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, hips are quite naturally tight from ambulation, from walking.
Yeah.
And it's what needs to open. I bring everything back in anatomy to basically you want to open up your spine. And in order to open up your spine, you have to open up your hips and your shoulders. So you got to get through the hips and the shoulders so you can be in your spine more comfortably, more fully, etc. And of course, hips and shoulders give us trouble because that's, you know, the shoulder is how we manipulate the world, and our hips is how we walk through the world. So they're naturally going to run into trouble and be tight, or, you know, hips tight especially.
Well, you mentioned it just now, spine, opening the spine, and I remember reading this. So I was reading you sent me a link to the nutation, counter-nutation, sacrum thing, and in that there was a discussion about this business, but there was also somebody mentioned about the fact that...
This business? What is this business? He went... Oh, the nutation, counter-nutation business. Oh.
Yeah. There was also somebody who mentioned about the fact of too much upper back opening, potentially flattening the natural kyphotic curve of the upper spine, the thoracic spine. We do quite a bit of, if you're doing prep work and stuff, we do, you know, for those people that are tuning in, certain parts of the spine are more adept at flexion extension, i.e. lumbar, thoracic, more rotation because of the superior and inferior articulating processes, shall we say?
Yeah.
One of the things. So is it right for us to try and increase the amount of extension available in an area which is designed basically more for the rotation? By doing... The
simple answer is yes.
Okay.
The more complex answer, which we could do 3 hours on the spine, which we're not going to do. If you don't put any emphasis or energy into the upper back, then it means all you're doing is working with your low back, and therefore potentially wearing it out.
Energetically in the practice.
Physically. Literally.
Yeah. No, I didn't. Yes, I didn't mean.
Sorry.
Yes. Yeah. Energetically in the practice, we're thinking about spreading the load, but I'm also talking about, you know, doing specific openers for the upper back in order to increase movement there to take some of the stress away from the low back.
Yes.
To create more of an even curve.
Well, it's never going to be even anyway.
No.
So with that, to that degree, definitely not. Most people from the average daily life,
Yeah.
you've got plenty of room to go in your thoracic spine to bring it into upright posture, and then even beyond that. There's room to go. And the other thing is the way those facet joints,
Yeah.
that's like a
Orientate.
nice, the way they're oriented, with a back bend, they just slide towards each other this way.
Mm.
It's not like in the lumbar, when you try to rotate the lumbar, eventually they compress this way.
Mm.
I mean, it happens at some point there as well, but it's sliding a bit first.
Okay.
And so, I don't have unreal expectations about opening the upper back, but certainly it's possible. You know, you've got 12 joints there.
Yeah.
If it is the way I say it is, if you gain 1 to 2 degrees of extension in each one of those, multiply it by 12, that's 24 degrees.
Mm.
That's the average. And each one won't move that much necessarily.
No.
The ones closer to the lumbar will move more than the ones up in the middle, and because of the way the spinous processes pop
Yeah.
off and how they touch,
Yeah.
potentially.
Yeah.
But still, you want to distribute the load. And that alone is the reason to work on the upper back.
Mm.
You know, then you got the shoulders following right behind the upper back,
Mm.
which have a very difficult time going in that direction
Mm.
usually.
Shoulders. Well, we're on shoulders then. we
We'll just jump right to shoulders.
Why not jump
Like
to
I said, shoulders,
Yeah.
tight shoulders lead to not
Exactly.
getting in the spine. Tight hips also lead not getting in the spine.
How do we work that external rotation? Have you got any? Because we need that to take our arms back.
We need it.
Yeah.
It's
But
true.
it's difficult to get it in there even with openers to get that movement going. It's much easier to work on
Internal.
medial rotation.
Yeah. It's true. Our body isn't really designed to very powerfully go into external rotation. It comes down to 3 muscles to externally rotate our arm. 2 rotator cuffs and the back portion of deltoids. That's it.
Mm.
Everything is designed to make it go the other
Yeah.
way.
A lot more muscles pulling
Yeah.
it this way, isn't it? And
Yeah.
big muscles.
Yeah, big muscles. So part of it might simply be doing the back bends.
Right.
That's part of it. I like to tie it into many more things than that. There's a very particular action required that, since we jumped off from back bends into
We're
shoulders.
coming back.
What's that?
We're coming back.
We're coming back around for a moment, yeah, because there's an arm movement in back bends that most people don't allow to happen
Okay.
because of the tension that you're
Yeah.
describing.
Yeah.
It can't.
Yeah.
But you can do that action in other places where there's less pressure and tension going into the joint.
Mm-hmm.
So down dog arms are the same potentially as back bending arms,
Mm-hmm.
right?
So you can work on the external rotation. They're mixed with the medial rotation of the lower arm. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Mm.
going to be that way anyhow. Yeah. Which ties into working with your serratus anterior.
Mm.
So we're not far off the shoulder.
Mm.
We're still in the spine somehow. But engaging the serratus in a way that brings the shoulder forward already increases the amount of external rotation.
Yeah.
Slightly, but it does. It brings it around in a different way, and then it gives you access to latissimus in a different way, which is probably the number one restrictor for the back bends.
Mm.
And externally rotating the arms. Because when you lay on your back
Yeah.
and you put your hands like this, you're already engaging serratus
Yeah.
to bring your scapula around the front more.
Yeah.
If that doesn't happen enough, the hand doesn't go flat. Or if your triceps is tight, your hand doesn't go flat. So having worked it in other postures, the same
Yeah.
arm position, then there's potential for there to be more when you get to back bending.
It's coming.
Yeah.
Perhaps we can we? No, you're going to say something.
Yeah,
go on,
because
go.
you can't look at back bending shoulders without looking at the front of the legs that's
Yes.
allowing the pelvis to move.
Yes. Psoas, hip flexors.
Psoas, hip flexors. I'm really big at the moment on...
You love psoas.
Well, I do love my psoas
Tell us.
a lot.
Tell us about psoas. How it's going
I-
to change the practice?
But I was going to say rectus femoris, I think, is a
Yes.
really big one for...
Because it crosses the hip, whereas
Because
the
it
others don't.
crosses the
whereas
hip,
the
And
rest
and
is-
it pulls on the front of the pelvis
Mm.
and makes for that restriction in the low back. often in back bend, which then prevents us from pushing further with our knees to allow us to work into the upper back and the shoulders. So it's this huge chain of joints. I mean, back bending is a huge discussion with the spine. I think from the beginning we're thinking about it wrong anyway.
Go for it.
Well, we're calling it back bending. What's the Sanskrit for back bending? Yeah, rather than front opening. Because the posture's name is Urdhva Dhanurasana, which is upward facing bow. There's no implication of, I mean, there is an implication of bending your spine, but when we say back bending, we focus on squashing the back bend instead of focusing on opening the front.
Because a friend of mine, Carolina, we were saying that when she started to focus or be aware of the Psoas and it was there and what it was actually doing, it sort of changed her practice.
As it should.
So,
do I need to say more?
You do. Everyone wants to know how now and why.
How now? Well, another big subject. Let's see how we can put this really tightly and succinctly. The psoas is the epitome of the core. Abdominals get included, but they're out on the superficial layer of our body. So if you really look at the core, it's the spine and then the muscles closest to it, which includes psoas. The other thing that it does is it sits on either side of our center of gravity. This is the key to psoas in terms of movement. Because it surrounds your center of gravity, it has a very powerful effect on it in its basic function and its more advanced function. Basic function, walking. Walking is a series of throwing the leg forward and letting your center of gravity fall into that foot and over that foot, and then switching to the next one and switching to the next one and switching to the next one. A lot of what we do in the practice is move our center of gravity around. So Carolina said that because she's doing Ashtanga, jumping back, jumping forward, jumping through, whatever the case may be. What we're really doing is we're taking our center of gravity and we're asking it to fly through space. And the muscle closest to it to control that center of gravity is the psoas. And it's a hip flexor, and the way that it functions when we jump back and jump forward, it's active in both of those, even though one it's getting longer, one it's getting shorter, which has to do with changing our body relative to gravity and then resisting the body weight falling through gravity. When we jump back is all psoas.
How can we tune into it? Because for some people it's almost been desensitized, hasn't it? And other muscles sort of take over and it's sort of a bit weak and it doesn't do its job.
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways of looking at it. It's a deep muscle. It's not superficial, so it's very hard to feel from the felt sense. Internal sort of receptors, sensing it contracting is not so easy. It's much easier to feel and see your quadriceps or feel your
bicep, whatever.
So that makes it more difficult from the beginning. So then it usually comes to a part of the conversation where people talk about either it's weak or they need to strengthen it or they need to open it. So which one is it? Do you need to strengthen it? Do you need to open it, stretch it, lengthen it? Well, most people it's probably too tight. And because it's so tight, it's weak. And it's tight because people sit for most of the day. We all do, right? And don't do anything about it, then it doesn't get lengthened. So instead of focusing on stretching it or strengthening it, I tell people to try to build a relationship with it. So how do you build a relationship with it? Intention. You focus on it. You try to imagine, pretend that all of your movement is coming from right there.
Deep inside.
Yeah. Everything. Forward bend from it, reach your arms up from it, jump back from it, jump forward from it, reach, stretch, lengthen, do everything from it. And this is where it kind of overlaps in a way with, Uddiyana. Not literally. Uddiyana is energetic. The psoas is very physical. But it draws our attention to our center, to our core, which, the main circulation point for energy always is somewhere below your navel and above your pelvic floor. And so it is with the yogic philosophy, the khandha is where all the nadis come out of. right? The serpent in Kundalini sleeps at the base of your spine. So you're putting your attention and intention there, and then you're moving from the core outward. That's how you relate to Psoas.
Is even talk about breath affecting Psoas because of the
Sure.
close attachment of the diaphragm to Psoas on the spine?
Yeah, they overlap each other
Yeah.
physically, therefore fascially as well. And the entire internal container of our abdomen, pelvic floor, psoas, spine, all has one common layer of connective tissue, and then you hit the connective tissue layer that surrounds the organs. So yeah, tight diaphragm can lead to a tight psoas, and an opposite as well. Pelvic floor tension is related through the psoas into the diaphragm. Sure. Yeah, everything's connected through connective tissue.
Yeah. And if we circle back around to our back bends, we sort of talked about one end, and now we talked about the relationship of the psoas rectus femoris to our back bend. How is that going to affect what's happening?
Well, what happens is when the psoas is really tight, or the other hip flexors, I would include all of them.
Yeah.
And I'm big on rectus femoris at the moment. I've got my little story I've got going at the moment. When those are tight, and you start to lift your hips up into the air, their restrictive tension pulls the pubic bone down, or prevents it from going up higher. And as a result, if your pelvis is going down and forward, then it means the lumbar is compressing more.
So they're looking for restriction at the leg end of the body.
You got to look for the restriction at the leg end of the body. And it's one of the postures where you need the hip flexors to be open already as you go into it. I mean, doing more back bending certainly helps that anyway. But if you're trying to do more back bends and you're at a state where all you feel is compression in your low back, look to your hip flexors, including psoas, rectus femoris, adductors, all of it potentially.
We take another side issue. You mentioned Seratus earlier, and I'm thinking now Chaturanga.
Good.
Seratus activation, rhomboid activation. A lot of people have problems with the winging scapula.
Yeah.
For me, it's difficult because mine have always just, I think if they just sit on your back, quite often you're not even aware how you make them sit there. But so for me, it's never been a problem. They've always just sat on my back, and that's been fine.
In Chaturanga we're talking?
In
or
Chaturanga,
just okay.
yeah. So yeah, and generally speaking as well, yeah. So for those that are having trouble controlling the lifting of the scapula away from the thoracic rib cage, how can they tune in on activating the muscles to keep it sort of sucked onto their back? And why do they need to do that? Or do they need to do that?
Yes, they do need to do that.
Cool.
I think
we agree on something?
We agree on something, yes. Well, I put serratus as one of two muscles in what I refer to as the psoas of the upper body.
Okay.
And serratus's function is really, I mean, it has its movements. It makes you bring your scapula around the front of your body and rotate it upward. But the other thing that it does is it stabilizes the scapula. And so you're talking about winging the scapula, and there's actually a medical condition called winged scapula, where if your serratus gets injured or the nerve that feeds serratus gets injured and the muscle atrophies and gets weak, then even at rest, forget chaturanga, your scapula will be popped off on the inner edge. You
see that sometimes in walking down the street in summer when people got loose blouses or backless backs. You can see...
If you see the scapula sitting way off the back, very weak serratus anterior.
Yeah.
Maybe injury, maybe not, maybe just lack of use, possible. So as it's a stabilizer, it helps stabilize the scapula in place.
Yeah.
And when we lower down into chaturanga, of course, our scapulas are going to move towards one another. It's a really tricky one. I did it here in the shala. When we go horizontal, our sort of named movements and the way muscles function shift slightly.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, it's really important to see how the shift happens. We're going horizontal, and we're stabilizing our arm and our scapula because our hands are on the floor.
Yep.
And if you connect all those bones together, it ends on the scapula, right?
Yep.
So what happens is when the serratus isn't engaged, the rib cage falls through the two scapulas.
Yep.
It's not necessarily just the scapula popping up.
Yeah.
It's that the rib cage has sunken.
And you can see that, can't you?
You can see it.
It's like, zzz,
Yeah. And so what happens is Seratus's fingers
Yeah.
are holding on to the ribs because the scapula is stabilized because it's connected to the arm, which is connected to your hand to the floor.
Yeah.
Those fingers lift the rib cage up. So that's the real action to look for even when you get to high plank. If you if you know when you lower down you have trouble and you want to work on it,
Yeah.
stay in high plank and really draw your chest through and push from your scapulas.
Yeah.
And you can subtly distinguish, if you pay close attention, you can straighten your arms and push from your triceps and your upper arm, and then you can add on to that from the scapula.
Yeah.
So that's a good exercise, is to distinguish between the straight arm pushing and the scapula doing the movement as well.
Yeah.
That's a good way to focus on it.
Okay.
And so when you lower down into Chaturanga, you want the action of the scapulas coming around the side
Yeah.
to stay. It's going to give up.
Yeah.
They're still going to move towards each other, but you want to pretend like you're going to keep it going in that direction as you lower
As you're
down.
lowering down.
And that'll force it into the triceps more.
And anybody that's wondering what Seratus looks like, look at a boxer. Yeah.
Yeah, it's called the boxer's muscle.
Yeah,
That's its nickname.
they're like ginormous, aren't they?
Yeah, big little fingers,
Coming
big
around
little,
the corner.
big little finger, big fingers sticking up over here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, it's so great for me to be here with you because it's like we didn't even get to do a proper intro, but you like the anatomy superhero sort of thing. but obviously that's only one dimension of what you do for sure. But for me, it's great to be at Purple Valley, which is like an Ashtanga paradise, and then doing all this. So this is cool. So it's like Christmas like only a week early or something. So Chaturanga, this is my way of getting back to Chaturanga. Chaturanga, how far down and how far forward? Because I've got like every video on the planet as far as Ashtanga goes, and I look at, Swenson, John Scott, even Kino, they're all like this far from the floor at the bottom of their Chaturanga.
Yeah.
Yet we often talk about keeping the upper arm.
When you say we?
Maybe not then. Can I include my...
Is it kind of like they?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. So some people talk about keeping the upper arm no deeper than parallel to the floor, which would mean like 90-degree angle, elbow, upper arm. Do you go with that, or you say no, go down in?
I say let it be a process.
Okay.
And when you're a beginner, keep the right form, don't go down as low.
Yeah.
For the majority of people, I would say elbow is behind the wrist, not on top of the wrist.
This is once we've passed beginner stage?
No.
Okay, we're back at beginner stage?
Even at beginner stage.
Yes.
I think what happens is people think the elbow should be aligned like the knee should be aligned. And they go with this 90-degree angle, and anything below that is precarious and dangerous. I don't think that's true. In fact, I think if the elbow goes back behind the line of the wrist, you actually reduce the wrist angle.
Yeah.
So it's less pressure on the hand and the wrist.
Yeah. What about at the shoulder though?
And then at the shoulder, it means that the shoulder is pulled back closer to the hand, which is supporting it.
Sometimes you look at people though, and they've got that low Chaturanga. It looks like you can almost see the top of the humerus pressing against the skin. You can see those forces coming forwards.
And I wouldn't say that a beginner should just plop down into that either.
Yeah.
So you got to tie together what we talked about with Seratus, stabilizing the scapula, so that when you lower down, you're not going,
Yeah, it's popping out.
Of course, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Because there's no stability there.
Yeah.
And then things are much more likely to get injured.
Yeah.
But if you've created the stability, as an advanced practitioner, like all the people who you named, have a very well-developed serratus anterior.
Yeah.
Because we've seen them all do the handstands and the arm bounces, which means serratus is there.
Yeah.
So the shoulder is stabilized next to the scapula.
Yeah.
It's not a problem.
Okay.
Beginner, problem.
Okay.
I think this 90-degree angle and taking the shoulders too far forward,
yes.
I say play with it for a moment.
Yeah.
Put your hands, do the 90-degree thing.
Yeah.
Go forward into your shoulders and then go backward and see which puts more pressure on and stress on the shoulder. The exception that I find is people with shorter upper arms. They're 90 degrees and quite happy. Because you got to look at this as it's like the pelvis, right? It's like a big area of body mass.
Yeah.
So if that's further away from the foundation, in this case the hand,
Yeah.
then it's going to require more muscular effort.
To hold it there.
The closer it is, the less.
Yeah.
When I do experiments in my anatomy workshops, like I ask the question, I'm always asking, is this true? For how many of you is it true?
Yeah.
So for 85, 90%, they say elbow back is more comfortable. And then there's some 15 to 20% that they feel more comfortable that way. So, okay, those of you who are the 15, 20, do it that way.
I mean, it's definitely harder work to take your shoulders forward.
Yeah.
But does that make it,
Does
it's
that
not the
mean-
same as uncomfortable. It just means you're working harder.
Yeah. But you're working harder at a joint that's more vulnerable. So you got to be mindful of that part, right? Because the shoulder is a fairly vulnerable joint.
Yeah. But something that's always interested me is some teachers say about the fact that in the Marichasanas, so for instance, Marichasana A, and more like B and D, doesn't really come into it so much for C, that this, the hip bone, so for instance on this side would be the right hip bone, should be grounded before you move forwards, whereas it tends to come up. What are your feelings on that? Where do you go with that?
Well, it's a forward bend.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe in bending forward.
Yeah.
Because you've bent one leg, you've made the pelvis more asymmetrical. The part that are we limiting this to A?
No.
Okay, mix around through all the
mix around,
Marichasanas.
yeah.
Yeah, cool.
D is like really evident.
D is
isn't it?
really evident, and
Yeah.
so is B.
Yeah.
The pose is asymmetrical because you bent your knee,
Yeah.
right, and you've got your foot there.
Yeah.
What happens if my lower leg is longer than my upper leg?
Proportion.
Proportion. So the longer this is relative to this,
Yeah.
the higher that sit bone's going to be.
Yeah.
Or the longer this is relative to how short this one is,
Yeah.
the more grounded that sit bone will be.
Yeah.
I've heard this. This has been happening for like the last 3 to 5 years, I'd
Yeah.
say. I have no idea where it's come from.
Yeah.
There's no tradition to support it.
Yeah.
Somebody's had the idea that sit bones on the ground need to be grounded
Yeah.
at all times, no exception somehow.
Yeah.
And the same thing is true for B and D. I would say if you do B and D with your sit bone down, most people are then going to have their other knee floating in the air.
Floating in the air.
So you're choosing one over the other.
Yeah.
So you're going to have a good reason why.
Yeah.
Because if you look at traditional images of it, if you look at Guruji or
Yeah.
Sharat doing it,
Yeah.
sit bone is up, sit bone is up.
Yeah.
David Swenson, sit bone is up.
Yeah.
I think the exception is somebody like Richard Freeman,
Yeah.
super open hips,
Yeah.
long limbs,
Yeah.
and so his proportions and openness help him.
Yeah.
If you are an advanced practitioner with really open hips,
Yeah.
I don't think it's a problem if you can do both the sit bone down and the knee down and say
Yeah.
Marichasana D. I don't.
Yeah. I've seen it done and it looks nice. Looks cool. But
Yeah.
for most of us, it's like
Yeah, not
Yeah.
going to happen.
Yeah.
And putting your sit bone down first and then trying to draw your knee towards the floor puts a lot of stress on the knee.
Yeah.
And I think it's a bad idea.
So knee down first.
Yeah.
Then worry about the sit bone.
I look at, the traditional adjustments that Guruji and Sharat did, and they always put the knee down, then laid their leg on top of it.
Kept
They
it
never,
there.
kept it there.
Yeah.
They never tilted any back onto their sit bone.
No.
So nobody's ever given me a really good anatomical reason for it,
Yeah.
philosophical reason for it, traditional reason for it. So I'm not a fan of it. I
Okay.
don't agree with it.
So, let's say proportion is not an issue. It is an
Okay.
issue, but we'll just say that we're starting our practice. We've been doing it 2 years. The sit bone's up, but that somehow our proportion isn't the thing that's stopping us. So we notice that the sit bone is coming down over a period of time. What is it that needs to release to let that happen? Is it the bent leg, half Padmasana hip, or something around the other leg?
It's both.
Okay.
It's both. The Padmasana, the inner part of that Padmasana leg would have to get really long
You're right.
for that side to drop down, because you've got the femur of the half lotus, and then
Yeah.
you've got the pelvis tilted up. The pelvis has to tilt down at that joint.
Yeah.
So adductors, rotators, all of it has to
Okay.
be super open.
Yeah, for that to come down.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
again, I wouldn't disagree with if you have your front knee down and your sit bone is up, to intend it down in order to create the opposition of lengthening your spine and twisting. I'm not opposed to that at all.
No. So the intention is there, but it's not a
not a requirement.
Exactly.
I think what's happened is some advanced practitioners who have opened their hips through, say, 3rd series and 4th series or whatever, or naturally have that type of body, have started applying that to beginners. Yeah. And I think it's a mistake.
Okay. So if we
I don't know where it started, but it started somewhere. Yeah.
I mean, it didn't make sense to me, so that's why I thought I'd bring it up with you.
Doesn't make sense to me either.
Yeah. So that's another thing we agree on. I think we actually agreed on like 98% of things, really.
Stu. I think
but
okay,
we
can be friends still.
We can be friends. If we go back to A, you know, as you come forwards more, it can be that hip lifts up more.
Yeah, and you start to lean over.
And you start to lean over. Yeah. So is that okay, or you know, is that?
Well.
Are we kidding ourselves that we're going forward more by leaning that way? Or
No. We're not kidding ourselves. I said this already, but they wouldn't have heard it. Yeah. Every posture has its process. Yeah. And the Ashtanga practice is very much about the form following the function. Yeah. Not the function following the form. That comes, John Scott said that to me, and I was like, you know, light bulbs going off. Yeah, of course it is. Yeah. It's about creating the openness in the joints, and then it cleans itself up. Yeah. That's the thing is, if we're always trying to fix it, then we're going on that assumption that something's wrong. But there's nothing wrong. Everything's fine.
Chakrasana then. I was saying to you off camera that my body work is we'd say 100% yogis. And the odd person, a friend of a friend, managed to get under the net, but near enough it's all yogis. And I see quite a few people with upper trap spasm, knots, directly attributed to dodgy Chakrasana, because they felt it happen during the... So what goes wrong for them? What are the key things to watch that you don't do?
Well, I have a particular way of teaching it. The first thing that needs to be in place is halasana, with the toes tucked under. I've heard teachers say to engage and press the head into the floor. I completely disagree. This is the beauty of yoga. We all get to disagree. It should be totally relaxed. The legs should be straight. I think that the difficult part for most people is timing, the rolling, the movement, the hand placement, and the press. Yeah. It's complicated, right? Yeah. So what happens is either if they don't put their feet on the floor, then what happens is their feet are floating, and when they go to lift up, they're actually trying to press their entire body up into the air in a very, when you're in this position, your triceps is at its weakest because it's so lengthened. Yeah. So you can't lift. So then what happens is you stress, and then your neck tightens up, and then you land on it again, right? Because you come back down to the floor.
I think some people give a little flick with their head as well to help them over, which is like,
no, I don't. I'm not a big fan of that. And I would say there's two chakrasanas. There's the rolling over the head, nice and easy, onto the feet, and coming into like a short down dog, and then stepping your hands forward. And then there's the advanced version where the feet don't hit the floor, and you just roll through it, and your feet don't hit the floor until your head is away, right? Yeah. So, again, there's a progression of postures and development of postures. Yeah. So when people are like in between those two, they don't know what to do, or they're mixing those two together, trouble often happens. Okay. They're trying to do the advanced version of it, and they're not ready, they don't have the strength, or the openness in their neck, and then everything tightens. Right? Because once you get scared, you freak out, the anxiety builds, this all happens instantaneously, then everything contracts, and then you start, and you're on your neck while it's tightening. Yes. It's unfortunate.
Okay, so while we're on the subject of things that can go wrong, and I think it's important to say at this stage that
they happen.
We bring issues with us, don't we, to the yoga mat
Totally.
Majority of the time from our daily lives, and that's why a lot of the stuff is happening. It's not that yoga is dangerous per se, or that you can hurt yourself. Quite often you're bringing a shit with you to the mat.
Onto the mat, totally.
But some things may be more easy to relate to yoga, such as SI joint instability or pain, that sort of thing. If people are suffering from SI joint issues, what can they do in their practice to take some stress off it? And maybe let me rewind that and say, what are the postures or the things to look out for that you might be doing that you're going to be throwing stress into the SI joint to start with?
There's 3 places where the most amount of stress goes into the SI joint. Rotations.
Yeah. Because
as the spine goes down, as the spine goes down and rotates, the last joint that it hits, right? You go L1 to L2, L2 to etc. You get L5 to the sacrum, and then the next joint down is the sacroiliac joint. And then the joint down from that is the hip joint. So in most twists, you've pinned your femur into place, and then you're rotating your spine. The spine gives, the hip joint gives, the pressure goes inward toward the center joint of that chain, which is the SI joint. So deep twisting is a very common place to feel SI joint dysfunction, especially if you're coming with it already. And then the next 2 places are deep forward bends and deep back bends, essentially for the same reason. Once you maximize the range of motion in the hip joint and the lower lumbar spine, the SI is sitting in the middle of those 2 things. So deep back bending puts pressure in the SI joint potentially. Deep forward bending, same thing, just in the opposite direction.
And what can they do in twists to
accommodate it?
Accommodate, but also to stop it happening in the first place. The deep twist, I always think of it as like those bandhas have been forgotten if it's dropping down into the SI joint.
It could be that.
Rotating the thoracic spine.
Yeah. Well, 1, don't go as deep. 2 is if you're blocking movement in your hip joints to accentuate twist in your spine, then allow the hips to move and be a little bit freer. That'll help accommodate the pelvic movement, because if you keep it too rigid, then you're putting more pressure in. Right? If you keep the pelvis fixed and then rotate the spine, it's going to go more in. So let the hips do some of the movement and some of the rotation as well.
And Warrior 1, that's another one that can be a bit dodgy on the SI joint.
Yeah. Usually because people think if they're putting their back heel on the floor that they have to square their hips. Good luck. Unless you've got very special open hips. 90% of people can't do that. But the striving to do that can put a lot of force and pressure into the SI joint. So you do one of 2 things. If you want to go untraditional, you lift your heel up and then you can square your hips. 2, you let go of the idea of squaring your hips and put minimal amount of effort into doing that. And the third thing is widening your stance, which allows the hip to then come around more on its own.
I've been doing that recently, and it's so comfortable to have that wider stance. So we're talking about a wider stance widthways, not lengthways.
Right.
And it just feels really nice.
Yeah, because you're not loading the leg with tension in the same way. Now, somebody could argue the opposite side of that. Well, you're not working the back leg in the same way through the front of it. So you have to find the balance of the 2. That's the thing.
So if you wanted to play with that wide leg thing, step your hand up behind step your foot up behind your hand rather than into the middle. Or is that too wide?
Something like that. I think most people cross their feet too much in going back through other standing postures as well, relative to how open their hips are. Right. We live under this rule that the front foot, the heel is supposed to line up with the inner arch of the foot, but that's somebody else's body. That ain't mine. So you need to be realistic with where you are. So any of whether it's warrior or let's say we do twisted triangle, which is kind of a similar setup, you should be able to square your hips first. And if you can't, then you might have to step wider. That's a good rule as well. So you can either do the back foot, or as you said, stepping the front foot and to the hand as opposed to the center line.
Because I'm becoming close to running out of time, so I'm going to get a few of these in while I can.
I'll try to answer short.
Supta Konasana. That always seems to be a posture that I'm in, and I think, what the hell am I doing here? Okay, I'm not quite sure. I'm here, I'm lying there, but I don't really feel like I'm ever doing anything. What actions should be going on, or should be just there thinking over here?
Embody the posture, Stu.
Yeah.
Interestingly, if you go back to the question about Setu Bandhasana in the neck,
Yeah.
so you've now done, by the time you get to Supta Konasana,
Yeah.
you've now done a series of postures where you've had your head and your neck extended this way,
Yeah.
tightening the back of your neck to reach
Yeah.
your chin out. It's a counter stretch.
So it's a counter posture.
Look at it that way,
Hmm.
if nothing else.
Okay. Cool.
Or, yeah, that's a good one. Or it's preparatory rolling for Ubayapanangushtasana and Urdhva Mukha Paschimottanasana.
That's cool.
Yeah, just a sequence of rolling postures that are coming.
Something I almost forgot was the fact that you've got a book coming out in March, which I'm really excited about.
I am too.
And
Thank you.
I asked you again off camera, I said to you, there's anatomy books out there at the moment, isn't there? Yoga anatomy. But I'm sure...
bunch of them,
A bunch
actually,
of them.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sure yours is going to be, different. So how is it going to be different? I mean, you've got years of practice with the Ashtanga, this massive knowledge base as far as anatomy goes. How does that evolve into a book?
Right.
What can we expect?
Well, I didn't write an anatomy for Ashtanga book.
No,
I didn't. Part of me wants to, but I didn't.
no.
There are a lot of books out there, and good books as well. And definitely I'm not one to just do what everybody else is doing. And I'm kind of glad I've waited to see what everybody else has done. And so the way I went different, and what I feel is always lacking in the delivery of anatomy, is making it simple and understandable. Making it delivered in a way that people feel like they're being guided on a journey, as opposed to splat, here's a bunch of anatomy, now figure it out.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like the first half of my book is like that. It's like a journey through the body. Major joints, problems, some postures mixed in here or there as examples.
Yeah.
The second half is more posture-based. But instead of going through every single posture and talking about what muscle is supposed to be working and which one's supposed to be turned off and all that,
Yeah.
which has already been done,
Yeah.
and that's great, nothing wrong with that.
Is there nothing wrong with that?
I mean, as an anatomist, it's not what excites me about
Yeah.
anatomy. I mean, I feel like anybody willing to do the work could open any kinesiology book, any
Yeah.
one of them, not related to yoga, and figure the same thing out.
Yeah. And is it helpful? Sometimes I
think-
read these things, and I'm an anatomy geek, and
Yeah.
I read it, and I think, well, it's interesting to me, but how do I even
Begin
do
to apply it.
To apply it,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it becomes a simplification of the posture that isn't very realistic.
Yeah.
Because the postures are much more integrated and the anatomy is way more integrated. And I agree, what usually happens is people start to associate very specific muscles with a specific posture because they look at it as very complicated. So they simplify it in their own mind by just picking one muscle that's really
One little
interesting,
part of it,
one little
yeah.
part of it, and the whole is lost. The synergy of the whole thing is lost. So hence why I did the second half of the book the way I did, which is instead of looking at individual postures, I looked at interrelated anatomical patterns. So I went off of that. So there's a very common pattern of external rotation in the hip.
Yeah.
Happens in standing, happens in seated postures.
Yeah.
So what postures do we see it developing in? What is the beginning of it? What is the penultimate posture that
Yeah.
exemplifies external rotation of the hip?
Yeah.
I did the same for back bending and forward bending and twisting and arm balancing.
Yeah.
So they're like families of postures. They're
Yeah.
not a sequence. I'm not making a new but so you start to see the interrelationship of
Yeah.
movement and postures.
Yeah. Yeah.
That to me is the application of
It
understanding
makes
the anatomy.
sense, doesn't it? Yeah. Then you can apply it as and when.
Yeah.
And in many poses, as you say, include external rotation of the hip or medial rotation of
Exactly.
the shoulder or whatever.
So whenever you see
Yeah.
external rotation of the hip going on, you know
Yeah.
that it's this related movement.
Yeah.
So once you understand that, then you can apply it in many places. Yeah.
Something, again, I'm drawing from the bodywork here, really. I've had people come to me that they've got a lot of tension, say, we pick the quads. They can feel it. They've got tension in their quads. Yeah, it feels like hard lumps and the rest of it. And so I say, okay, spin on your stomach and we'll just see what range of motion you've got. And they've still got fantastic range of motion. You can take their heel to their bum. You could take it by the side of their bum as if they were doing Bandhasana or whatever.
Right.
So they've still got a massive range of motion yet they've got this tension in the muscles. So we might think maybe it's being taken up in the tendon or whatever, but how can they work it? That's the problem they come to me with. They say, "But I do this, I do that. How can I?"
I'm not clear on what it is that's bringing them to the point of conclusion that they need to do something about it.
I think because
does it hurt?
I think they can feel it. Yeah, they can feel that this doesn't feel like the rest of their body, that they are holding tension here, and it's hard as against soft. So they can feel the difference in the quality of the muscle in relation to
other muscles on their body.
Yeah.
So I was going to say, some people are naturally more dense and tight and hard. Some people
it's not like their whole body is hard. Okay. It's like...
I mean, it could be leftover patterns from some other activity that they did that's now layered in on top of the mat, like you said, bringing stuff to the mat. A lot of the practice is letting go.
Yeah.
Or just as much letting go as it is striving and trying to make something happen in a posture. You got to find the right balance of those two things. So it might even be, more of an attitude, like of, trying so much that in places where they don't need to.
Yeah. So maybe
and
it's more,
And, it's kind of another little principle or theme of, at some point, you only need to use the minimal amount of effort to do something. Why maximally contract something if it's not necessary? This is my whole thing with, like, squeezing the buttocks in back bend.
Oh, yes. Go on then. Tell us. Glute max. Contract or not?
Do you need it?
Do you need it at all?
You might need it to lift up initially, of course, because that's what gluteus maximus is built for.
It's a hip extensor.
It's not just a hip extensor.
Yeah.
It's a hip extensor specifically for powerful hip extension, where the joint is at the most egregious disadvantage mechanically, right? When I walk, I don't use glute max, but when I run, I use it.
Yeah.
So it's for that like added extra power.
Yeah.
Or if I squat low, I'll use it.
Yeah.
If I just bend my knees a little bit, I'll use it less.
Yeah.
So do we need it to initially get up into back bend? Yeah, sure, maybe. Does it need to be on the entire time at 100% effort? It's a big use of energy.
Yeah.
And it tends to rotate the legs out as well.
Yeah.
Right? So it's a good example, because what happens is when you use a muscle like, and this one I see much more than, let's say, your example of quadriceps.
Yes.
People with really tight glutes.
Yeah.
And you watch them do up dog, super hard.
Yeah.
Back bend, super hard.
Yeah.
And then, that's going to relate to that power in the hip extensors has to be balanced with the hip flexors. So what is Psoas doing?
Yeah.
It's got to work with that. So it's got to build and strengthen and tighten against it sometimes. And you start creating imbalance in the body. To me, use it to get up and then use it minimally.
Yeah.
I'm not saying 100% off even.
Yeah.
But same thing maybe is happening with the quads for that person.
I
don't know, individual basis, but...
I think it was more about how to work with that when you've already got a lot of flexibility there.
Soften.
Get into it.
Probably a soften. Yeah.
Cool. I think that's all we've got time for. I mean, I got a million more questions here. I haven't quite filled the book, but there's plenty in there.
Yeah.
And, great for your time and this fantastic place, Purple Valley.
We'll do more next year.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool.
Cool.
Thanks, dude.
David.
Yeah.
Take care.
Cheers.